Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's my pleasant task to introduce to everybody Colin Walker. I think everybody really knows Colin, but for people that don't, Colin is really one of the mainstays of the Scout organisation regarding history. He is a leading authority on Scouting history, and he was also the main consultant for the 2007 Brownsea get-together for the celebration of 100 years of Scouting. So with no more ado, I'd like to hand you over to Colin, and I hope that you all have a pleasant evening.
There you go, Colin.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to move now to the next slide, Ian, which is our motto, the Scouting Milestones motto. I was going to test you when it had gone off the screen, but just in case we could just all say it together because it's very important. Scout history is inspirational. Let's use it to inspire. And that's the entire purpose of all the talks that I do, and certainly the purpose of this one this evening. So as Ken said, in 2007, I was busy on Brownsea Island at the sunrise ceremony. In fact, for a few days before, when I'd been to stay in Brownsea, and on the very day that Baden Powell, before the camp, was in Brownsea Castle, I was addressing an audience of the great and the good, and I was able to tell them that I was standing in the very room where Baden Powell had stood, in the very space exactly 100 years before. So I wrote this book to coincide with the anniversary. The book, still available, I hasten to add, is 150 pages long. So I thought it was going to be an easy task delivering this talk because I've done it before and it's all here in the book. But you would be amazed just how difficult it is to condense it down to just 1 hour. So I should be missing a lot out. I'm condensing it down to give you a flavour of Baden Powell the man, because it's a very easy thing to say, yes, he was in the Boer War, yes, he had his first experimental camp on Brownsea, glossing over exactly what it required of the man and what it gave to Scouting, because there's some important lessons there that we have long overlooked. And so the purpose of this evening's talk is to go back and examine what he did, why he did it, and what we can learn from it today. So you've perhaps heard of a book called The Two Lives of a Hero by a Swedish person who emigrated to America, who was a scout, and his name was William Hillcourt, and he wrote this big biography of Baden Powell, Two Lives of a Hero, which I think is a very apt title because he made his fame as the hero of Mafeking, and that was his first life, his army career, and then of course he had his scouting career. And I'm fond of pointing out that everything that Baden Powell did in his first life, right from the days that he was at school, right from being a child, as we'll see later on in the talk, everything he did in a charm sort of way prepared him and helped him in his second life in scouting, every single thing. So, but without the fame of being the hero of Mafeking, there would be no scouting. And just as a little illustration from that, I'm going to show you 3 artifacts that we call Mafekana that most people will have never seen. Would you believe that 3 different companies making mangles, you know what mangles are? You put your sheets out of the wash tub full of water through the mangles. And as a boy, I used to stand at the side and turn the handle to make the rollers go around to wring the water out of my mum's sheet. 3 different companies made mangles with Baden Powell's head on like that. Now, can you just believe that? And then the next cast iron artifact is my own possession. In my garden there, you see Baden Powell pub table. Now, these are not that uncommon, but usually they've been renovated. And if they are, you'll see Baden Powell will be picked out in gold against a red or a green background but I've just left mine as it was. These are a style of, you can see BP look underneath this head, and there are a style of tables which are called Britannia tables, and they're made out of a steel called Britannia steel. They were very common in the Victorian period, and other celebrities were put onto tables, but Baden Powell was by far the most popular. And the same company then made a much rarer artifact, which you're going to see now, and that is an umbrella stand. So one of those is very, very rare. There's one currently on eBay that's been much mucked about with, and if you want to buy it now, it's £1,100. So they're just there as an illustration of the fame that Baden Powell had because of the Siege of Mafeking. Nobody else had that quantity of artifacts made directly after the Siege of Mafeking. Not before or since has anybody achieved such status as a celebrity than our hero, Baden Powell. So at the end of the siege, a new word entered the British dictionaries, which you can still find in quality dictionaries today. And that word is to maffick, comes from the word mafficking. And to maffick means, the dictionary definition is to celebrate uproariously. There never was a celebration in London equivalent to the Siege of Mafeking relief. Not the First World War, not the Second World War. We're told that every London theatre had somebody coming onto the stage because the news came to London in the evening, and somebody in every case went onto the siege and said, Mafeking is relieved. And the whole audience came out on the streets. They formed in processions. They processed to the streets past Mrs. Baden Powell's house, and it was like no other celebration ever. Now, unfortunately, Baden Powell couldn't return. He did return for a very brief little holiday, but he couldn't be relieved of his army command until 1904. And in 1904, he came back to live in England, and he was very soon snapped up by the Boys Brigade, which was the oldest organization, youth organization in Britain of the day, led by a man called William Smith, and he was made into a life vice president. But everybody wanted to meet him. I said at a meeting that I once held that all the women wanted to be with him and all the men wanted to be like him. So that's a brief explanation. I don't know what you can say to young people today to get across to him just what a celebrity he was. I mean, you could say he was the David Beckham, I don't know. Put all the celebrities you can think of in one room and Baden Powell would outshine them all. It was, I'm not exaggerating, he was the most famous Britisher alive in 1901, with the exception of Queen Victoria. And of course, all the big people in their big houses, the landed gentry, they all wanted Baden Powell to attend their house parties because he was the person that people wanted to meet. And he was, in 1904, going around to these country house parties, and the one question that they wanted to know is what happened in Mafeking. And we know that he told them stories about the Mafeking cadets, don't we? This came to the ears of a philanthropist. But before we go, no, we'll go with the philanthropist Pearson. He went to visit Pearson in 1906. He was a newspaper magnate. He published magazines and newspapers, and he was very interested in Baden Powell's pronouncement that he thought that the training of young people to take responsibility would help them to be better citizens. And Pearson challenged him and said, so Baden Powell, you think that you could train young people from Britain to become better citizens if they were to do the sorts of things you did with the boys in Mafeking? So Baden Powell thought for a minute. He said, well, yes, I mean, it would be a big thing. And so Pearson said, if I was to fund such an organization that we're thinking about, would you be prepared to lead it? So a deal was struck. Pearson would offer Baden Powell upfront a sum of his money to defray his expenses to form this new organization. And at the same time, the leader of the Boys Brigade, William Smith, he'd said to Baden Powell, I see you wrote a book in 1899 called Scouting, scouting for the army. What about if you were to write a book for our young people called Scouting for Boys? So Pearson had latched onto this idea and he said, Baden Powell, I'll give you this funding on the proviso that when you publish this book, we will be the company that you will choose to publish it. It wasn't daft, was it? Because that was the most best-selling book in the world, still in print continuously since 1908. It made a remarkable deal, and it didn't just end there, because he said, you're going to need a magazine to keep in touch with all these people in this new organization, and we, Pearson's, will publish it. So he did a very, very good job. But £120,000 was the equivalent in today's money that Baden Powell got, which enabled him to start with his organization. But he'd got a lot of work to do before he could. He was still being lionized. He was still going around to the country houses, and he was invited across to Ireland, to a place in Ireland that belonged to a family called the Van Rolts. Van Rolt's a Dutch name, but this gentleman, his family had been living in England for some time, and he was exceedingly rich. He had a big, big country house in Tipperary, which is the house that Baden Powell went to. He had a huge, huge house in the most famous area of London. And as well as that, he owned other properties scattered around. So he's at this big country party in Ireland, and he's doing his usual party trick of talking about the siege of Mafeking. And he's now able to add on to it that he's got this sponsor who's going to back him. But the thing is, he was missing one vital ingredient. He'd got the fame as the hero of Mafeking. He'd got the backing from Pearson. He'd got the money to organize what he wanted to make happen. And Pearson had got the mechanism for publicizing everything he did. It sounds like an absolute ideal formula to move forward and to present the world with its latest youth organization. There's one thing, though, missing out of the equation, and I wondered if you'd guess what it is. He had one serious deficit, and that is he was an army officer. And the second one is he was a bachelor. He had had no experience whatsoever of dealing with young people. Now, you might play back to me that he was the hero of Mafeking, and in his talks around the country, he was fond of talking about the Mafeking cadets. Well, he was, but he was the commander-in-chief of the besieged town. He had no time for dealing with Mafeking cadets. He delegated that, as army people tend to do, to his chief of staff, Lord Edward Cecil, who just happened to be the Prime Minister of England's son. But Lord Edward Cecil, being a great army man, he delegated that to Lieutenant Ronnie Moncrief. And we know, or at least I know from the records kept in Mafeking, that Lieutenant Ronnie Moncrief spent half of the siege locked up in the town jail because he was an alcoholic. But however, we know that the Mafeking cadets did a sterling job, but it wasn't through, it was under Baden Powell's inspiration and guidance that they were allowed to become messengers and relieve the soldiers so that they could go and be in the trenches. But honestly, Baden Powell would have had no time for training them. So he'd no experience of training children. No, at all. He'd got lots of ideas. Ever since the siege of Mafeking, he'd got an old ammunition box which came from Mafeking, and in it he would put little notes about the things he found out about different cultures that would help young people to take on the responsibility of manhood. And he collected all those into this tin ammunition box, and he wanted to try out those ideas on real live youngsters. So when he's talking at this house in Knotlofty in Tipperary to the Van Rolts, and here is Mrs. Rolt now, quite a stunning lady, and she was obviously very impressed with Baden Powell because some days after this meeting, she sent Baden Powell this book. Are we going to see the book? Yes, we are. There we are. Look, that is the book, not the very book, but it's a copy of the same book that she sent to Baden Powell, and she wrote it. And not what's more, like Baden Powell, she was, I think, an extremely talented artist, because it's full of these beautiful watercolors. And there you can see her illustration of Brownsea from across from sandbanks. So she listened to what Baden Powell had to say, and then with her husband, here he is on a postcard of the day, dated 1908. So what a find. No postcard yet. Here it comes. There we are. So there is Charles Van Rolt, and there is Baden Powell. Not Baden Powell. There is the castle across the sea from Sandbanks to Brownsea Island. Only a matter of a few hundred yards, but it's a couple of miles if you go by boat from Powell. Okay, so Baden Powell was looking for a quiet place to have this experimental camp and gain some knowledge of actually dealing with young people. And he explained all this to the Van Rolts and their guests. And Mrs. Van Rolt, who must have been like all the other ladies, very taken with Baden Powell, said, well, it just so happens that we have an island on the south coast of England, just off Powell, and it's got a castle on it. And we don't usually have any visitors at all because it's a private island. So would you like to have the loan of that for your camp, because it sounds very exciting. So of course, Baden Powell gladly accepted. And so now, as I said to you a few days before the camp, Baden Powell went to Brownsea Island, stayed in the castle, and there he found it was a very, very sumptuous place. And here I've got a book, which is the library catalogue from Brownsea Castle, which just gives you an idea of the affluence. There is Van Rolt's library plate, look. And he employed a librarian and a calligrapher to keep his library catalogue up to date. And just look how beautiful that is. Really, really beautiful. And the whole catalogue is full of library books. And Baden Powell really enjoyed his short stay in Brownsea Castle prior to the start of the camp. So it was all ready now, wasn't it? He'd got everything he needed. He'd got the money, he'd got the prestige, he'd got the publicity, and now he'd got a place. So what did he have to do? He had to go have a look at Brownsea and see what it entailed. So here is a map so we can see. I know one person who's looking at this map will know it in great detail. Adam there lives very close to. So we'll look at the map. And there is Brownsea Island. So just across where it says the campsite, you can see that narrow neck of water there. That's looking across from Sandbanks, which is, Adam, the most expensive piece of real estate in Britain, is it not? Millionaires Row. There is, but if you go on the road all the way around and across to Powell Harbour, you can just see the groins on Powell Harbour there. It's a 2-mile journey across to Brownsea. So you can see there is an arrow that I put in there that shows you exactly where the campsite is. So we'll take a close-up now at where the campsite was. This is a very peculiar postcard. And you think, wow, didn't know they made a postcard actually taken on Brownsea of the camp. Well, the truth is they didn't. This is a mock-up. Some enterprising person got a picture of the campsite and put in cardboard cutouts of the tent and retook the photograph to make it look like it was the camp. But that is the campsite. Now, that cottage that you see there isn't there today, but it was there in 1907. Because Brownsea has got some clay deposits, which the owner of Brownsea, before Van Rolt, thought was going to make his fortune because he thought it was China clay. He thought it was kaolin, and he'd be able to make a fortune out of it. But it turned out not to be China clay. It turned out to be brick clay. So there was a brickyard on Brownsea Island, and this was the cottage of the foreman, and he lived there. But in 1907, it was totally derelict, and Baden Powell, the great opportunities, using everything that he could find to serve his ends, used that house as a way of teaching his boys how to escape from a fire. We'll see a bit more about that later on. Now, it's not there today, because way back it got bulldozed into the sea. Now, because it's the foreman's house of the brick company on Brownsea, it was made of brick. One of those bricks in about 2007 got onto eBay, and that brick fetched £187 because embossed into the brick it said Brownsea. Now, just remember what I've told you. What happened to that house? It got bulldozed into the sea. So next time you're at Brownsea, just roll up your trouser leg and go for a little stroll into the water, put your hands down, and with any luck, you'll come up with a £187 brick that says Brownsea. There are some earlier ones, but I think they're worth less money because the earlier ones didn't say Brownsea. They said the early name for that island, which was Brownsea. As the first name was Brownsea. But there we go. So that's the site that Baden Powell chose. So now we're going to move on. And we come to Baden Powell looking at who he's going to use as the guinea pigs in this great experiment. Of course, he did have some friends, his army friends who got married and they had children. And so he thought that they might do. So he collected together Lord Rodney, who at the time was divorced. So he had to get the consent of Lord Rodney and his wife, and went and visited them both. And they got 4 children. No, we're not quite there yet, Ian. But we'll just hold that picture there while I'm talking about the Rodneys. So 4 Rodneys, all 4 boys, Baden Powell's friend. Yes, they could come to the camp. And then there were 2 nobles from Northumberland. Now George Noble was an army friend, Baden Powell's army friend, and he had a brother called Saxton Noble. And Saxton Noble was just happened to be the business partner of Armstrong, Lord Armstrong of Cragside, who was the biggest manufacturer of armaments in the country. He manufactured battleships and later on aeroplanes, but cannon, and Saxton Noble was his right-hand man. So he was a very, very wealthy man. And so now we've got friends of Baden Powell comprising roughly half of the boys on Brownsea. But here's the thing that makes Brownsea so special, because Baden Powell was so special, because when he was only 8 years old, he developed for himself a set of laws, much like the 10 Scout laws that I learned when I became a Scout in 1952. We had 10 laws then. And Baden Powell's law, one of his laws, was that he said that the crossing keepers, now these were people in London that cleared up the horse muck off the road so the gentry could cross the road without getting their clothes mucky. So these crossing cleaners, said Baden Powell in his laws, should be as happy as we are, and they should be able to live comfortably like we do. So aged 8, you could say he was socially inclusive. So that was his motto. Just before I start talking about how he made it socially included, I've forgotten to mention that there was one other special boy who wasn't fit in the category of Baden Powell's friend, but rather his nephew, Donald. So we're looking at Donald now, and you'll see he's a lovely lad. Photograph's a little bit out of focus because it was taken out of a much, much bigger photograph, but you can see he's 8 years old. He's a fair-haired lad, and he's not counted, or he wasn't counted in being one of the boys at Brownsea, because Baden Powell variously described him as a helper, or an army word is adjutant. But however, you can see on his sleeve there, he's got the 2 badges that might look like one badge, but there are 2 separate badges there that Baden Powell designed for the boys in Brownsea if they did all of the activities and showed themselves proficient in them. So Donald did that. So he got the badges. So if he got the badges and he was at Brownsea, he is therefore a Brownsea boy. Would you not agree? So now we can have a look at the boys who were on Brownseas in this list that's out of the book here. And so what we've got there, you'll see after the person's name, we've got asterisks. These asterisks are, what are they there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's roughly 1/3 of the boys with an asterisk, and the asterisk denotes that they died in the First World War or just after it as a result of wounds received in the First World War. So if you went to Brownsea in 1908, you'd be old enough to volunteer in 1914 and therefore spend the 4.5 years of the First World War in the army. And if you did so, you stood a 1 in 3 chance. That's exactly the same statistic with the boys who went to Humsoft the following year, a 1 in 3 chance of dying in the First World War. But there's another equal and opposite matching statistic, which is a bit more acceptable. And that is, if you look down the middle column there where it says age, you can perhaps see that Brian Evan Looms lived to be 100. And then you've got Cedric Curtis, 72, and you've got Humphrey Noble, 76, Arthur Primmer, 91, Simon Rodney, 85, George Rodney, 83. So roughly 1/3 of the people on Brownsea died as young men in the First World War, but 1/3 of them lived to be a ripe old age. Okay, so now we move on now and have a look at just how significant was the great experiment that Baden-Powell was now going to embark on. What we're looking at very shortly is going to be in glorious Northumberland. I have to say it's probably God's own county, even though I live in Yorkshire. And this is a wonderful place. This is Chillingham Castle up in Northumberland, not too far away from the coast. And it was the home of the nobles that we've talked about earlier on. So 2 of the nobles two boys lived in that castle, which their family had in Northumberland. They had another big country house over near Hexham, which is why the next camp was at Hexham, at Humsoft. And then they had a big house in London, as well as other properties splattered about the place because they were extremely wealthy. So this is just one of their piles. So that's where the great and the good. And remember, the Rodneys were Lord Rodney's children, and he got 4 of them, and they lived in the castle as well. So 1/2 of the population of this great experiment are going to be from the ultra privileged of society. Now, Baden-Powell said, poor people ought to be able to do what we do, and they ought to be able to live to our standard. So what does he do? He invites, remember, he's the vice president of the Boys Brigade. So the Boys Brigade, like Scouting, is now had groups all over the country. So he contacts the 2 nearest groups to Brownsea, which is Powell, and just along the coast from Powell, there is the seaside town whose name I've forgot, but I will remember it shortly. And in Powell, which supplied 3 of the Brownsea boys. So we're moving on now to Powell, and there we've got a nice Victorian street, probably a little bit posher than some of the Powell boys lived in, but behind where these beautiful Victorian houses are now, with the Victorian lamppost look, there was a not such a favoured area, but it's all been demolished. And one of the Brownsea boys went there. His name was Arthur Primmer, and he lived to be a ripe old age. And he said, when they came back from Brownsea, he started the world's first scout patrol after Brownsea, weeks after Brownsea, in 1907, not 1908, in a wash house, in a house just behind these. But these 2 contrasts I've just showed you, 2 of the boys, not 2 of the boys, 6 of the boys lived in castles. And here we've got in Edwardian times, 10 town boys, Baden-Powell called them. He was fond of saying that there were boys from Eton and boys from the East End. Well, he was getting a bit carried away with his alliteration there. There were boys from Eton. There were boys from Eton. Lord Rodney's sons went to Eton, but no boys came from the East End of London. This is the East End they came from. They came from Poole and from Bournemouth, the Boys Brigade at Bournemouth. So can you just imagine in 1908, in class-ridden Great Britain, it very likely that the sons of lords and millionaires would share the same tent? It would just be unthinkable. It was the greatest social experiment in inclusion that the country had ever seen. And Baden Powell said, I mixed them all up like plums in a pudding. And he didn't say it in a Yorkshire accent. That's what he said. I mixed them all up like plums in a pudding. And it took a little while for the two lads, lots of lads, to get on with each other, because the sons of the hoi polloi, not the hoi polloi, the sons of the gentry were a bit repulsed by the fact that they saw the local lads going along the beach with their penknives, taking shellfish off the rocks and then eating the shellfish. I don't for a minute understand why they should be repulsed, because their fathers in the West End would be doing just that with oysters, wouldn't they? And champagne, of course. But they were. And the local lads found it absolutely hilarious that the public school boys would put their hand up and ask where the bathroom was in the campsite, which I've got some sympathy with. Right, so the two lots of boys all being mixed up like plums in a pudding. So now we come to the next slide, which the Scout Association had built to explain what was going on this island. This stone commemorates the experimental camp of 20 boys held on this site from 1st to 9th of August 1907 by Robert Baden Powell, later Lord Baden Powell of Gilwell, founder of the Scout movement. And a guess who put that lettering on that stone? Our good friend Don Potter, Rover Scout from just outside Gilwell, who was present on the first training camp at Gilwell and responsible for carving a lot of the things that the Thane Rover crew have now renovated on Gilwell. But he was apprenticed by E.E. Reynolds and by Gidney to the most famous stone carver of the day, who just happened to be the most celebrated calligrapher as well. So Don Potter learned his skills from Eric Gill, the very famous deviser of fonts. Don't tell me you've never heard of him. Just go to your computer and look down the list of fonts and you'll come to font Gill Sans. Gill Sans was Eric Gill, and Don Potter learned his skills from them. And it's a beautiful stone and it's a beautiful calligraphy. There's only one thing wrong with it. I wondered if you've spotted what wasn't a deliberate mistake. It was what Don Potter was told to carve, but it is wrong. So wrong. Put your hand up if you spotted the deliberate mistake. No, well, I'm going to have to tell you. An experimental camp of 20 boys. Well, I've already told you there were 21, because there was Donald, wasn't there? And we can't now exclude him from being a camper because we've seen he got the badges. So there was Donald. But Baden Powell, when he was making his lists out in 1908 for the Scout magazine, he was working from some bits of paper which people had signed at the time. And somehow or another, he managed to overlook the fact that there were 4 Rodneys. He only put down 3. And the missing Rodney was Simon Rodney, who was a patrol leader. And there's plenty of evidence that he was there. I have a letter written by another Brownsea boy. Is that the actual letter in which he says, this boy says he was in that boy's patrol. And the Eagle comic in 1957, at the time we were celebrating the centennial Baden Powell's birth, in the Eagle magazine, he wrote a little article talking about his time on Brownsea. There were definitely 4 Rodneys. So now we've got Donald, and we've got the Rodney, and we've got the 20 boys that we know about. So we've got 22 boys. Well, that'll do for going on with. That's proved it's wrong. But in a while, I shall be telling you about yet another Brownsea boy. So we've got the boys. We've got them all going to be mixed up like plums in a pudding. Now Baden Powell couldn't possibly run that camp all by himself, could he? So he needed a lot of help. So we're going to go to Brownsea now and look at the first scoutmaster in the world on Brownsea, the man himself. And here he is. And have you noticed anything about his hat? We've got two things that we need to say about his hat. One is there's the same badges that were on Donald's pullover, do you remember, on the sleeve? And I said it wasn't one badge, there were the two badges. Well, there they are on Baden Powell's hat. He made them. And we'll go into why they're the shape they are in a bit. The second thing to say about the hat is it's not a wide awake hat. It's not a lemon squeezer. It's not a scout hat. Well, funnily enough, Baden Powell's fame came from him being the hero of Mafeking. But in Mafeking, he didn't have a scout hat either. But the only picture that all the newspaper editors had was taken before Brownsea with him wearing the hat. So every article about Baden Powell during the time of the siege, when he was most famous, showed him wear the scout hat. But amazingly, when he went to Brownsea, he didn't take that hat. He took this one, which is called, it's got a name, it's called a fedora hat, which means that it flat packs. You can squash the brim down and put it in the suitcase. And Baden Powell said he was experimenting with the fedora. I'm glad the experiment didn't work. This experiment failed. He didn't wear the fedora in scouting, I'm glad to say. He did there on Brownsea wear what he used as a model for scout shirts. He called it a coarse-haired shirt, and he designed that very shirt when he was Colonel-in-Chief of the South African Constabulary after the siege of Mafeking. This was an army register, an army regiment whose job it was to take over the areas vacated by the Boers as the British armies pushed forward to Pretoria. They were catching acres and miles of land, and it needed to be maintained in British control. And that was the job of the South African Constabulary. And Baden Powell had great respect for the boys. So he used the colours of the Orange Free State, orange, and he used the colours of the Transvaal, green, to make the colours for his regiment, which he then brought over into scouting. But here we are, we're looking at the shirt he devised for his uniform, and it's unique. It's got two rings on the sleeves, much like a Navy officer's, but then it's got these two diamonds. So there we are. We haven't got a proper scout belt yet, but we've certainly got a belt. We've got shorts and we've got garter tabs. Do you see the garter tabs? So we've got, iconically, the scout uniform. He didn't wear the neckerchief on Brownsea that he devised for the South African Constabulary, which was green and yellow. He wore a tie. And if you read Scouting for Boys, you'll see that scouts were offered two options. You could either wear a neckerchief or you could wear a tie. So just as contrast now, we're just going to take a quick look of the scout uniform that Baden Powell devised a year later. So here he is with the neckerchief from the South African Constabulary in green and yellow. We've got the scout hat, and there on his shoulders are the knots going all the way down to his elbow, and they're white because that denotes Group Scout Leader. And the colour white for Group Scout Leader was in use right up to 1968. So he's got a scout belt on, but you can't see it. But on the scout belt is this leather pouch there, in which he put his binoculars. He's got shorts on, smartly polished shoes, and again a pair of socks. So you can see how the uniform progressed from Brownsea to there. So now we go on. Baden Powell needed more help than just himself, obviously, and so he picked on a very old army friend that joined him in India 1 year after Baden Powell left school and went to India. 1 year later, he was detailed to go down to the quayside with the doctor of the regiment to pick up the latest junior officer. And the doctor couldn't find this person that was supposed to be meeting. All there was on the quayside was this boy, this English boy. So they went across to talk to him, and it turned out that the boy was McLaren, Kenneth McLaren. And from that time, the boy was what he was called. It was Baden Powell's best friend. Now, Tim Gill spent a whole chapter in his book trying to promote all sorts of rumours which now have no place in society anyway, but were totally untrue at the time, about some sort of sexual relationship. Even Gill had to admit he had no evidence whatsoever. But this isn't the time and place to talk about that. What is the case is that I discovered this gravestone by pure accident when somebody wrote to me in about 1907 an email, because by that time I'd got my website and I'd written about Kenneth McLaren being Baden Powell's assistant scoutmaster on Brownsea. And this chap wanted to know if this gravestone was the same Kenneth McLaren. Well, of course it is, because if you just look at the right-hand side of the bottom of the gravestone, you can just see McLaren, and next door to it, it's DSO. Well, Kenneth McLaren, DSO, was indeed Baden Powell's friend. So Baden Powell, when he got into Mafeking, he had to split his frontier forces up in two halves. One half went into Mafeking, and the other half had a roving commission. They were cavalry, and their job was to harry the Boers. Now, 3 weeks before Brownsea was relieved, the officer in charge, General Plumer, decided that he would have an attempt on relieving Mafeking. And so that's what they tried to do. But unfortunately, McLaren was shot through the leg and left lying on the ground. Now, the apocryphal story is that a Boer went up to bayonet him on the ground after the retreat of the British, and the Boer soldier or officer noticed that McLaren was wearing a Freemason insignia, and so he spared his life. Whether that story is apocryphal, we'll never know, but that is the story. So he was taken to the Boer hospital. Powell became aware that he was in the Boer hospital and wrote him letters, of which I've got copies of all of them. The first one's very interesting because Baden Powell does not sign himself Baden Powell, because he did not want the Boers to know that he had any sort of affection for this man, because they would use it against him. So he signed himself by a different name, but it became apparent that they did know, and so the later letters are signed Baden Powell. So they maintained their friendship, and in 1907, Baden Powell persuaded McLaren to become the world's first assistant scout leader on Brownsea. Unfortunately, McLaren's war wound got worse, and he also got severe dementia, such that he didn't even recognize Baden Powell. So a really, really sad end. But a sadder end was that this email that I've told you about was written to me by a man who had acquired the ownership of some fields off a Scottish sea loch on the west coast of Scotland, just near a very tiny village on the coast called Tinnabruick. And this man had acquired this site, which had previously been earmarked for a caravan camping site. And he wanted to know if this man was McLaren, because if it was, when he renovated the campsite, he could do something about this shambles that you see, and it would encourage scouting people particularly to go to the campsite. Well, unfortunately, planning permission had been refused the first time round, which is why there wasn't a campsite there. And when the chap tried a second time round, it was refused again. But anyway, on one of my expeditions to Scotland in my tin tent, I turned up at Tinnabruick and went to the post office and inquired of the postmistress if she had a clue where this grave was. And she said, indeed she does, because she'd still got the planning application that this man had made to try and get planning consent for his caravan site. So she got the map out and unrolled it on the counter so I could see where it was. A 2-mile walk, and we're at the edge of a copse on the fell side. Everything else is green and purpley, just heathland and moorland. But there's a steel cast iron fence you can see running around the back of this tree here. And we had to scramble over that into this mess of yew trees, totally overgrowing. And here is the gravestone of the world's first assistant scoutmaster being torn apart by yew trees. And as far as I know, that is the state of affairs now, only it'll be worse because it's 10 years, 13 years on, isn't it? So a person that scouting should honor, that's how he ends up. Tragic, absolutely tragic. Okay, so he's now got an assistant scoutmaster, but he needs even more help. So he gets in touch with the Coast Guard, Adam, the Coast Guard from Sandbanks. He's an imposing character. Can you see him? See his white hat and his lovely beard? Well, this is Coast Guard Stephen, commanding officer of the Coast Guards in Sandbanks, and Baden-Powell thought he'd be just the man to teach these young lads all about the Heimlich Maneuver. And here they are doing the Heimlich Maneuver. You know, if you've not heard of the Heimlich Maneuver, it was the method of resuscitating drowned people, popular in 1907. I think it was still going the rounds in about 1957 when I was doing it. So interesting picture. This, first of all, the young man with the cap next door to the Coast Guard, that is Arthur Primmer, and Arthur Primmer went to jamborees in America because the Americans know the value of people who went to Brownsea, so they paid for him to go. And he had this photograph done with this message that you see. But it's an interesting photograph because it shows the class distinction of the boys. There's no class distinction, but they have to wear the clothes that they were sent to Brownsea in, don't they? So the three public boys lads, and the lad on the left-hand side in the hat, of course, is Donald, only 8 years old. And the two on the ground, I think, are Rodneys. So they're wearing sun hats because that's what the upper class had, sun hats. Interestingly, the lad who's got his hands on the patient's hips has got a badge on his sun hat, which I think is one of the badges we've been talking about. Arthur Primmer is standing up and he's got like a Yorkshire flat cap on his head, and so has the other boy. So they were all being treated the same, but there was a discrepancy in the clothes that they wore. So that wasn't the end of the team, because in order to get permission for the Boys Brigade boys to go to Brownsea, Baden-Powell had to approach the captains of the Poole Boys Brigade and the Bournemouth Boys Brigade, and he inveigled these two men to become helpers on Brownsea. Now, Boys Brigades, and this is not in any way meant as any sort of criticism of the Boys Brigade, because it was the biggest youth organization in the world for quite a long time after Scouting was formed, and they did marvelous work. And as you know, they were mainly a religious organization, but they went camping, so they were doing some of the same things that Scouts did. And indeed, under Baden-Powell's guidance, they formed their own Boys Brigade Scouts and Church Lads Brigade Scouts later on. But when they went camping, they had a totally different model. I don't know if you've ever seen a Boys Brigade camp, but it's a row of tents in straight lines, rows and rows of tents in mathematical precision. And then behind them, you see a big marquee. And Boys Brigade camping is catered for camping by caterers. And Baden-Powell followed that model. He used the Boys Brigade men to organize the camp, the feeding of the lads at Brownsea, except on the night that they went out in pairs to do bivvying. Not all together, just two at a time. And there, when they were out there, they cooked their food, and they rolled up their pastry onto sticks to put over the fire like we all did. But they made them in the sleeves of their jackets. And one of the lads who was there and did it, when asked about his abiding memories of the cooking, he said, well, there was a lot of extra vitamin in the twists because there were sandflies. So the sandflies got mixed up with the dough, and that's what went into the twist. But anyway, it was those men, Robson and Green, I can remember those, Robson and Green, and they were the Boys Brigade men. And Baden-Powell gave them a special task, because he said, what I want you to do is I want you to find me 2 whalers, 2 rowing boats, and 2 harpoons. So what a thing to ask for. But they didn't let him down. They went to the Chandlers, and indeed they got 2 rowing boats and 2 harpoons. So now we're just going to look at the badges that the boys were wearing on their sleeves, and Baden-Powell had on his fedora. Now, this isn't one of those badges, but it's so close to it. This is a badge that Baden-Powell designed in 1895, having written a book on reconnaissance and scouting for the army. he decided when he'd got sufficient rank to make it happen that he would train reconnaissance scouts in his regiment. And when they were trained, he would reward them with a badge. And this is the badge that he devised, a fleur-de-lis. Earlier on in his army career, he was asked to improve the accuracy of the marksmanship of the men in his particular section because it was the worst in his regiment. And up until that time, the way of doing that was to give the men a pay rise if they achieved the targets, the standards required. Now, Baden-Powell didn't choose that method. He devised a badge, not this badge, but he devised a marksmanship badge. And the philosophy behind that was the badge would go on the shoulder of the man that had earned it. So the man would receive a personal investiture, if you like, of giving his badge in front of his contemporaries by his commanding officer, recognizing his skill from the people that mattered at the top. And then from ever on, the other men in the regiment would see that from his badge on his shoulder, he had achieved the standards. So here was a person to look up to and try and emulate. And that philosophy is what Baden-Powell took to Brownsea and became an integral part of the Scout movement. Because the badge that Baden-Powell designed was so like that badge you see there. Only Baden-Powell cut it out himself out of a sheet of brass, and it looked like this. Here we go. Well, we're not seeing the picture at the moment, but it's very similar to the one we saw earlier of the fleur-de-lis and the scroll of the boy sitting, who was laying on the ground, in two parts, the first class badge and the second class badge, designed by Baden-Powell and taken from his time in the army. And then there was the scroll badge. Then there was the scroll badge. Now, this badge that we're looking at here was the badge that I devised looking at those photographs that you've just seen. I enlarged them, and this is the nearest I could get to. So when we had the reenactment camp on Brownsea for the sunrise ceremony in 2007, there were two teams of boys and girls who were reenacting being the scouts on the boys on Brownsea, so that there were two squads, so one could take over from the other. So we made them these badges. They were made for us, and they were made by machine. They've not been cut out of brass like Baden-Powell did. And the "Be Prepared" along the bottom was stamped in by Baden-Powell using a separate stamp for each letter, whereas this has been done by machine. But nonetheless, that is the nearest anybody's ever got to reproducing actually what those badges were like. So now we can move on now and talk about another aspect of the camp, which was this photograph here. Now, I don't know how many of you like taking photographs, but if you know anything about composition of pictures, you can see on the right we've got a very tight group of scouts, and you can see the boy there with the second class badge in his hat facing Baden-Powell. You see the cap and the second class badge, the scroll badge up there. Well, these boys, it's a great photograph because they're all looking down to a focal point, which is what you want from a photograph. But unfortunately, we've got this great big space to the right-hand side. So when you see this photograph in a book, as you may well have done, you aren't going to see it's cropped off within inches of Baden-Powell's backside, if you forgive the expression. So you don't see the left-hand side of the picture at all, which is a great pity because there is something of immense interest on the left-hand side, and that is the first patrol flag in the world. Now, we know that there were 4 patrols on Brownsea, and here is the patrol flag of the wolves. So I hope you can discern the wolf on that badge. Then we see the letters BA. And when I was writing my book and pondering what on earth BA could possibly mean, I was losing sleep over it. And as so often happens with these things, you wake up in the morning and you've got a very clear idea what the answer is, whereas you'd spent hours and hours and hours trying to figure it out nights and nights before. And the answer is that Baden-Powell's first visit to Brownsea was not in 1907. Baden-Powell had an older brother, Warrington, who was a merchant navy officer, and he'd built a 4-ton ketch called the Diamond, and he'd taken his brothers around the coast of Britain, south coast of Britain, which is where Baden-Powell said he learned to be a sea scout. Now, I bet our friends from Paul will know very well what I'm going to say now. Every port in Britain has to have registered, the boats in the ports have to have registered letter and a number which shows their port of origin. And the registered letter is the first letter and the last letter of the port. And Baden-Powell would certainly have known about that, because his brother's yacht, the Diamond, would have had such a registration. So what do we think the BA stands for on the patrol flag? Well, the first letter of Brownsea is B, and the last letter of Brownsea is A. Now, I'm not telling you this is a fact, because I've never seen it written down. This is my supposition, but I bet my pension on it. Okay, so now we're going to look at, it's easy to say, the first 4 patrols on Brownsea. Well, Baden-Powell had to decide there were going to be patrols. What was the purpose of a patrol? So he made boys patrol leader. The oldest boys, the senior boys, were made patrol leaders. And he had those boys form a court of honor, which existed in scouting right up to the 1950s. And the court of honor looked after the younger boys, looked after their discipline, sorted out squabbles, and were generally given responsibility. That was the basis of the patrol system. Of course, it doesn't work so well now that we often encounter patrol leaders aged 13 and a half. But when scouting had patrols, the boys had been at work, some of them since they were 14 years old. They were working with men at 16 years old and patrol leaders. They were well able to take on the responsibility of helping the younger people come on. So Baden-Powell incorporated the patrol system into scouting, and here we see it at work. Now, this was one of the great revolutions that Baden-Powell brought about. He wanted to know how children learn. He joined the National Union of Teachers. He went to teachers' meetings, conferences to find out how children learn. He was a disciple of the great Montessori, the female educationalist from Italy. And he actually went across to Italy to meet her and tried to carry out their teachings. And so bringing these boys up like this was a part of this social revolution that was going on Brownsea. Now, I was an educator. I was a head teacher. I was a head teacher at the time that we were Ofsted inspectors. And if you ran a secondary school, you'd get great kudos from the Ofsted inspectors if you incorporated a school's council with pupil representatives from each of the years. And this is what was going on here on Brownsea in 1907. Baden-Powell would have got great marks from Ofsted inspectors because he was revolutionary. So just to carry on that for just a little bit more, one of the things they would do, they'd have a campfire every night, and at the close of the campfire, you can just imagine the scene. We've got the boys, the campfire on the edge of the beach. Behind the beach, backing up, is the grass leading to the tents, and behind the tents, the dark green of the coniferous trees, looking down across the campfire in the sparks to this mesmerizing man who was telling the boys the stories all about the Knights of the Bushido and about the Red Indians in America and all these other tribes' romantic stories that the boys could only wonder at, and looking across the waters that were lapping into the Brownsea Sound, and seeing this man that was mesmerizing them and hearing his voice, and he was telling them what it was that they were going to do tomorrow. And then it was time to make their way back from the campfires to their tents and get down into their sleeping bags. And the sound of his voice would be going through their heads. And he would have been telling them exactly what they were going to do in the morning. So they would wake up with a sense of anticipation. And there would be these helpers that Baden Powell had gathered, and they would be demonstrating to these lads the skills, not just talking. They would be getting, as we saw, the Coast Guard standing there imperiously. It was the boys that were doing the Heimlich Maneuver. And then that's what they would spend the morning doing, learning these skills that Baden Powell thought was important to future citizens. And then it was lunchtime. And then after lunchtime, something amazing. He sent them all to lay down for 1 hour. Now, if you're an educator, you will know the value of stopping swatting, drinking water or whatever drink you like, as long as it's not alcoholic, and resting your mind so that you can then focus on that which you've learned, and your memory will, believe me, work a whole lot better. If you want to get better marks in exams, do not swat all night, swat in 20-minute batches and then have a rest. Baden Powell had latched on to that idea from his work with the National Union of Teaching, and he employed it on Brownsea. He sent the boys back to their tents to lay down for an hour. And then what did they do? They played games. Not any old games, games that he had devised that used the skills that he had learned in the morning. So here is this man who was an army officer, who's got a better understanding of how children learn than most of the teachers you've ever encountered. And I can say that because I was one. He was phenomenal. The Brownsea camp was just an amazing complex of revolutionary ideas. So now we're going to have a look at some of these games. So Baden Powell, as I said, he thought it's incumbent upon him to find out everything he could about how children learned. And he got a role model in a way, because there was already somebody in the field who had created a great outdoor movement, but in America. And that man's name was Ernest Thompson Seton, who actually came not far from Seton Delaval in Northumberland. Or it might have been in County Durham, I forget which. But whatever, he came from England, from the north of England, and he emigrated to Canada, and from Canada he went into America. He's got an absolutely fascinating life story. Regretfully, we don't have time to go into it, but Seton had started a youth organization called Seton's Indians, and they even had 5 branches of Seton Indians in Britain. So Baden Powell corresponded with him and borrowed a lot of the material for Brownsea from Ernest Thompson Seton. Now, later on in life, that caused trouble because Seton claimed that Baden Powell never acknowledged that he got all this information from him. And Baden Powell said, well, he said, if you read Scouting for Boys, you'll see there are something like 23 references to you and 1 to your wife. To which Seton replied, I've never read Scouting for Boys, which was a shame because he was the first Chief Scout of America. But anyway, these tracking irons that you see here were devised by Seton, and Baden Powell had permission to use them on Brownsea. I'm not sure he had permission to be selling them in the scout shops, so that when Seton did eventually come to England and found his tracking irons on sale in the scout shops, for which he was getting no royalties, he wasn't best pleased. But there we are. You put these rings inside and strap it to your shoe. So we'll look at the next one. And another sort of tracking iron, and you can see the way the strap goes through and goes to the shoe. So on we go. Now, these 2 postcards we're going to see now, you can see at the bottom, they're created by Ernest Ibbotson, an artist, in 1908. And they're actually illustrating what went off at the Humshoff camp. You can see the boys are wearing scout uniform, and they didn't do that on Brownsea. But this activity was called Bang the Bear, and it was a Seton game, and it was played on Brownsea. I don't think Health and Safety would have thought much of it today. So now we go on to the next Seton game, which was even more dangerous because Seton called this Hunt the Great White Sturgeon. Well, we don't have sturgeon in British waters, so Baden Powell called it Hunt the Whale. And there we've got a log with a tin fin. And these are the 2 whalers that Baden Powell said the Boys Brigade men had got to come up with. And these are real harpoons. And the object of the game was to row out to these logs as fast as they could, sling the harpoon into the log, then row like hell back to the beach. And it was the first patrol to get back to the beach with a whale. Now, I wonder if you would like to write a risk assessment for this activity. Can we just not see that the harpoon this boy is going to throw now is going to glance off this log in front of him and go straight into the heart of the boy bearing down in great speed on the road, on the boat opposite. And then both of these boys are going to get their harpoons in this log, and they're both going to row like hell back to the beach. And one of the harpoons is going to fall out, and all the boys in the boat are going to fall out the boat, aren't they? I mean, what it wouldn't do, would it? But I bet it was great fun. So they're two Ernest Thompson Seton activities, as is this next activity we're going to look at now, which is called Spotty Face, and it was really an observational game. But interesting, so what Baden Powell had these cards made up, and then he would hold them there for 3 or 5 seconds, then put them down and expect the boys to replicate the pattern on a piece of paper. Now we see behind us our little lad again, Donald, with the badges on his sleeve, and another little lad leaning on the bank with the badges on his sleeve. So we go on to more activities done on Brownsea, and these are actual Brownsea photographs taken on Brownsea, but there was only one photographer there once, and that was on the last day. And last day was a sports day and activities for parents to come and look at. But here we have the Rodney on the floor kneeling with the badge on his shoulder. And again, you can see the difference between the town boys and the public school boy. But who's this boy standing in the middle? He doesn't seem to fit into either group, because the public school boys are mega smart and the town boys are not so bad, because their parents knew they were going to camp with the hero of Mafeking. So they sent them in their best clothes. This lad here doesn't seem to fit in, does he? So just bear him in mind, because we're looking at him again in a bit. So on we go. So you remember we said that they used the old house as training for how to get people out of the house in a fire. Well, this was the training. So here we've got this ladder going up to the cross beams that are square lashed to the tree, and the lad leaps off the top of the ladder, and everybody's having a great time, I expect, except for the lad. But you can see it's probably not his mother that's over there on the right hand side, because she's laughing her head off. All the adults seem to be having a great time. Donald here on the left, you can see he's just putting his jacket back on, and he's wearing a tie like his uncle, and you can see the badges there. So now we can go on to the next picture. Now, I don't know if you've ever done this activity with Scouts. I have, and I was absolutely gobsmacked at how useless they were. This is throwing a line, which could be vital in any rescue. Give a lad a coil of, well, just give him a rope. Give him a 30-foot rope and ask him to throw it, and you'll never have such fun in your life as the activities he will get up to. And here you can see he's being trained to do it properly, because they've got a rope that's weighted at one end with this stick that the boy's going to throw, which is attached to the rope. So on we go. And here we've got wrestling. A lot of these activities, I think this was quarterstaff fighting to start with, because the two boys have got two stakes there, look. And here we've got Baden Powell's idea that he was impressed upon him at the time of the siege of Mafeking, when 1/3 of the people who were applying to be soldiers had to be turned down because they weren't fit enough. So a lot of his philosophy in the early days of scouting was to keep our population fit. He wasn't a warmonger, he wasn't training soldiers, but his motto was be prepared. And young people had to be fit enough to be prepared to come to the aid of the state should it need it. So physical fitness was very important to him. Now you'll see there's a boy there in the middle with a bag. Now let's concentrate on that boy, because he was the same boy on the last picture. So we go to the next one. Here he is again, wearing the same bag. Now this boy is the hare in the Hare and the Hounds game of tracking. Now Baden Powell thought of everything, because when you're going through a sand area like this boy is now, the tracking irons will work superbly. But when you're going across the field, the tracking irons won't work at all. So the boy has got a bag, right? And in that bag, forget paper chase like we saw in the Railway Children. Baden Powell was too much of a conservationist to be littering paper all over the shop. So in that bag was full of seeds. So when the boy got to ground that wasn't going to take the impression of tracking irons, the boy scattered seeds so his trail could be followed. Now that boy is Arthur Broomfield, and he was the son of the gamekeeper. And the gamekeeper wrote in a book that his son rode round from where they lived every day to join in the fun of the camp. And he was allowed to do so by Baden Powell. In fact, his first meeting with Baden Powell was he found Baden Powell besmirched in a bog, in a boggy area of Brownsea. That was their first meeting. But Baden Powell allowed him to take part in the activities. And what better person would there be for the hare and hounds game, because he, Arthur, wasn't a part of any of the patrols. So he was the ideal person to be the hare. So then when we came to the last night, Baden Powell gave presents to every boy. And we know that because 2 or 3 of them exist. There were books inscribed by Baden Powell on Brownsea. So let's move to the next slide. And we can see that Baden Powell had a present for Arthur Bromfield on the last night so that he wasn't left out. And that was the very bag that he was wearing round his shoulder. Now, this bag, therefore, was used on Brownsea in 1907, and it's now 2021. So it's got some age to it. And this bag came to light when the daughter, who is now 90 years old, of Arthur, made an approach to a scouting collector friend of mine and told him about Arthur, which this man already knew about because he had read my book on Brownsea, where I mentioned this boy. And so here we have candidate 23 of the boys on Brownsea. We'll have a gamekeeper's son who rode round in his boat. He was included in the games. And on the last night, he was given a present because remember, Baden Powell was about inclusivity. So the sign that Don Potter carved said there were 20 boys on Brownsea. No, there weren't. There were 23. So this is the proof. Okay, so now we're going to have a quick look at the icons on Brownsea at the time of the camp. And we have here the Kudu Horn. This Kudu Horn here isn't Baden Powell's Kudu Horn, but it was the Kudu Horn of 2 different chief scouts. And the lion's fur around it denotes that it probably came from a native chief before they had it. Now, there's a hole here and you blow through it. I've never been able to do it, but I know a man that can. So there's the Kudu Horn. It's the biggest antelope in Africa. It stands at the shoulder over 6 foot high, and its 2 horns are each 3 foot wide. So it's a huge, magnificent beast. And Baden Powell did not kill Kudu out of sport, and he had to take a patrol out looking for people who had murdered British settlers, and he hadn't got enough food for them, so they shot game, as that was what happened in the day. But he brought back the Kudu Horn, and he took the Kudu Horn to Brownsea, and there he devised a code which he taught to his patrol leaders, which didn't, of course, have Kudu horns, but they had whistles. So there were different sounds that you could blow on the Kudu Horn, but with the whistle, which had a hole in it, one single hole, like a recorder, you could make different noises with the whistle. So he had a code for different signals, which he devised on Brownsea. So that's icon number 1, which still exists today. It's in the White House, but unfortunately, it's not in a fit state to be blown. And then we come to another iconic symbol of the camp, which was the Union flag, because all the boys had to learn the symbolism of the Union flag. You can see what state it's in. But again, this was the following camp, the following year in Humshoff. We haven't got a picture of that flag actually at Brownsea, but we're told that it was used at Brownsea because it was the flag that flew over Mafeking, and you can see the damage that's been done to it. Now, I'm quite proud to tell you that that damage has been repaired at great cost, and the flag stabilized by a member of our Thane Rover crew who donated quite a huge sum to the Scout Association, particularly tied to the renovation of that flag, which you can now see on the wall in the White House in a stable situation, which should last for quite a long time. So we're getting on now, and what we're going to look at now is a letter. And this letter, there were only 5 letters written on Brownsea. 3 of them were to people who Baden-Powell owed a letter to that was nothing at all to do with the camp. 2 of them were about the Brownsea camp. I'm proud to tell you that I own both of them. And this is a photocopy, a very old photocopy, not one that I've done, of the signature at the bottom. You can see Baden-Powell characteristically signs it, and the R is the wrong way round. Look, can you see that? He said, the camp has been a great success, but hardish work. Au revoir. Forgive the hasty scrawl. And why was it hasty? It was hasty because it was the last day. And the tide was coming in. The weather was changing. The Boys Brigade boys went across the chain ferry to Sandbanks, so they were safe and sound. But the public school boys had got to row back, or be rowed back, 2 miles across a sea that was increasing in severity, wind getting up. Tide was now in the wrong direction. We know that the older boys were asked to row. They must have been quite frightened because the spray was coming in over the top of the bow. And can you believe it? We are told by the Baden-Powell, Robert Baden-Powell, Baden-Powell's grandson, that he was told by Donald himself, who was on board that boat. He said that they decided that they'd make the boat lighter by tipping overboard all the things that they had made at the camp, and everything to do with it in the bags went over the side, including the Brownsea badges that Baden-Powell had made. Well, can you believe that? The hero of Mafeking gives you a handmade badge and you're going to throw it up over the side. Hard to believe. Well, I don't believe it. But on the other hand, nobody has ever seen a brass badge made by Baden-Powell at Brownsea. So now we're going to move very quickly on now to tracking on now to right up to 2021, to the event of last May. And here we see Brownsea's Scoutmaster. Anybody see that photograph before? There we have 2 Thane rovers standing by Brownsea in May on the day that Baden-Powell statue was due to be moved. The crane was in place. And there were some people who said that the Scout movement should move on without Baden-Powell. Well, I hope I've convinced you from this talk this evening that the founder of Scouting approached his task in hand, which was to build the world's biggest youth organization. Over 49 million scouts in the world today, and over the time since 1908, over 400 million scouts, and that's not counting guides, have grown up in the inspiration of this man who founded the world's first ever scout camp on Brownsea. He said it was a scout camp. I've written about it in this book here. On the cover, you see the green fleur-de-lis, the first ever use of the fleur-de-lis in scouting, which was on the letter-headed paper that Baden-Powell designed for Brownsea. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop talk, but I hope you've been able to see behind the words and look at the inspiration of our founder. Now, if you've got any questions, I'm going to look at them now and I hope I'll be able to answer some of them.